If you look at the last decade of brain science, something quietly changed in how researchers talk about consciousness. It used to be treated like a philosophical residue, a topic you could gesture at but not reliably test. Now it is increasingly framed as a measurable phenomenon with constraints, signatures, and controllable transitions. The shift is not that science suddenly found a single consciousness center in the brain. It is that the question got sharper and more operational. Instead of asking what consciousness is in the abstract, labs ask what changes when awareness appears, stabilizes, fragments, or disappears. This is why you hear language that sounds almost like engineering: signal, bandwidth, noise, integration, coherence. Those words are not metaphors meant to impress people. They reflect a move toward describing consciousness as something that has dynamics, not just content. In that context, the idea of consciousness as a field or signal comes back, but in a different tone than pop mysticism. A field, in physics, is a structured distribution that can be measured as it varies across space and time. The scientific version of this hypothesis is simple. Maybe subjective presence is a fundamental property that complex systems can couple to, rather than a byproduct invented from nothing. At the same time, neuroscience stays grounded in the evidence that the brain matters in a causal way. Change the brain state, and you change the conscious state, often predictably. That pushes a different framing. The brain could be a receiver, filter, or interface that tunes access to experience, rather than the ultimate source of experience itself. Older debates often got stuck because they mixed categories. Some arguments were pure correlation, mapping brain activity to reports without explaining why those patterns should produce experience. Other arguments were pure mechanism, describing circuits and computations, while sidestepping the fact that experience has a first-person quality that is not the same as behavior. What forced progress was not philosophy, it was reality: anesthesia, coma, sleep, and altered states. These conditions make consciousness change in ways that are repeatable and clinically meaningful. They also demand definitions that can be used in experiments, not just in debates. So the new way science is approaching consciousness is not one dramatic discovery. It is a tighter loop between measurement, perturbation, and modeling, with less patience for vague claims on either side. The most honest position is also the most productive one. Map what consciousness tracks, identify what can shift it, and let the deeper ontology remain an open question that evidence can keep pressuring. Consciousness research now starts with a more precise assumption. Whatever awareness is, it shows up as a change in system behavior across time. Not a single snapshot, but a pattern that holds together, updates smoothly, and stays internally consistent under noise. That is why scientists focus on dynamics like integration, stability, and breakdown. A central idea is that conscious experience depends on how widely the brain can coordinate information at once. When signals remain trapped inside small local loops, you can still get processing, but the result is often fragmented or unavailable to report. When signals become globally shareable across networks, experience tends to feel unified and accessible. This is where coherence enters as a candidate mechanism. Coherence does not mean every neuron fires in sync, and it does not mean a single rhythm explains everything. It means the system finds a workable timing relationship that lets distant regions exchange information without constant interference. Resonance is the practical version of that coordination. Networks can lock into shared rhythms that create reliable windows for communication, like aligning clocks so messages land at the right moment. When those windows collapse, information can still move, but it becomes noisier, less stable, and harder to integrate into a single stream. The receiver or interface framing fits here in a non-mystical way. Even if consciousness were a fundamental property of reality, the brain would still set the conditions for coupling, like tuning a radio, changes what becomes audible. Your experience would depend on the brain's capacity to maintain coherent communication and filter what enters the global workspace of awareness. Modern models also emphasize prediction, because the brain is not just reacting, it is continuously forecasting. Conscious content may reflect the brain's best current model of the world, stabilized by ongoing error correction. When prediction and sensory input converge, awareness feels clear, and when they diverge, awareness can become unstable or distorted. What makes this approach different from older talk is that it invites causal tests. If a theory says integration and coherence matter, then disrupting them should reliably reduce awareness, and strengthening them should change clarity, continuity, or reportability. That is why stimulation, anesthesia, and controlled pharmacology matter so much in this field. The deeper implication is that consciousness may not be a thing the brain either has or does not have. It may be a mode the brain enters when it reaches certain thresholds of complexity, coordination, and stability. In that sense, the mechanism is less like a light switch and more like a phase transition in how the system organizes itself. Neuroscience has converged on a practical reality. Different consciousness theories can be compared because they make different predictions. Global workspace models expect conscious content to become widely available across many systems, especially when it can be reported, held in working memory, and used for flexible control. Integrated information approaches focus more on the structure of causal interdependence inside the system, not just how far signals broadcast. What matters is that both frameworks push beyond simple localization. They treat consciousness as something that depends on how patterns evolve and how strongly parts of the system constrain each other. In that view, the key question is not, where is it, but what kind of organization makes it possible? This is also why researchers increasingly talk about complexity measures. When awareness is present, brain activity tends to look both differentiated and integrated, meaning it is rich in detail, but not falling apart into isolated fragments. When awareness fades, signals often become either too stereotyped or too disconnected. From the physics side, the word field has a precise meaning that can be kept clean of hype. A field is a set of values defined over space and time, like temperature across a room or electromagnetic strength across a region. When people propose consciousness as a field-like phenomenon, the serious version is about whether subjective presence could be described as a fundamental feature that systems can couple to under certain conditions. A useful bridge between neuroscience and physics is state-space thinking. The brain can be modeled as a system moving through an enormous landscape of possible activity patterns. Conscious states may correspond to stable regions and controlled transitions in that landscape, while unconscious states may correspond to collapsed dynamics or limited exploration. You also hear discussion of criticality, the idea that systems near a tipping point balance stability and flexibility. A brain operating near critical dynamics can rapidly reconfigure while still remaining coherent enough to hold a unified experience. This is not magic. It is a known property of complex systems that can be tested with data. Quantum language often enters these conversations, and it is important to handle it with restraint. Most mainstream consciousness science does not require quantum effects to explain neural dynamics, because warm, wet biology usually washes out delicate coherence. Still, quantum ideas persist as questions about whether there are deeper constraints on measurement, causality, and the relationship between observation and physical description. The honest synthesis is that we can make progress without pretending the ontology is settled. We can map consistent signatures of awareness, test causal levers, and compare theories by their predictions. If a field-like framing turns out to be useful, it will be because it adds explanatory power and testable constraints, not because it sounds mysterious. If consciousness is approached as a signal-like phenomenon, the brain starts to look less like a simple generator and more like an interface. It converts sensory input, internal body data, and memory into a usable model, then stabilizes that model long enough for awareness to track it. What you experience is not raw reality. It is the brain's best controlled access to reality. Perception is therefore not passive reception, it is active selection. Attention works like a tuning mechanism, boosting certain channels and suppressing others based on goals, uncertainty, and predicted relevance. Two people can be in the same room and still occupy different conscious worlds because their tuning is different. A major piece of that tuning is interoception, the brain's readout of the body. Heart rate, breathing, gut signals, and hormonal state continuously shape salience, mood, and the felt sense of self. This is why shifts in physiology can change the texture of awareness even when nothing external changes. The coordination problem is solved through large-scale loops, and corticothalamic circuitry is often treated as a stabilizing backbone. The thalamus is not just a relay station, it participates in timing and gating, helping distributed regions align their activity. When those loops break down, experience can become noisy, unstable, or absent. Intonators. Anesthesia is one of the cleanest probes because it disrupts consciousness in reproducible ways. Many anesthetics reduce long-range integration and alter the brain's capacity to sustain complex, differentiated patterns. The body may still show reflexes, but the organized state that supports subjective presence can collapse. Illusions and hallucinations also reveal the interface model. They show that experience follows the brain's predictive constraints, not a perfect copy of sensory input. When priors dominate or sensory precision is misweighted, consciousness remains vivid, but accuracy can drift. Time perception adds another layer to the interface idea. Consciousness feels continuous, yet the brain integrates information in windows, updating the model in discrete cycles. When those cycles change, time can feel stretched, compressed, or strangely segmented. So even if you take seriously the possibility that consciousness is fundamental, the brain still matters as the shaping instrument. It sets the bandwidth, filters noise, aligns internal rhythms, and selects what becomes reportable. In this framing, the brain is the condition that makes a broad potential for awareness become a specific, structured experience. Emotion is not an extra layer sitting on top of cognition. It is part of the control architecture that shapes what becomes conscious. It sets priorities, assigns urgency, and changes how strongly certain signals compete for attention. In practice, emotion influences the bandwidth and stability of awareness. When the system is calm, the brain can keep a wider and more flexible workspace online. When the system is threatened, attention narrows, and consciousness can collapse into a small set of repetitive concerns. That narrowing is not a moral failure. It is an adaptive bias that becomes costly when it stays stuck. This is where coherence becomes psychologically tangible. Anxiety and rumination often look like unstable or looping dynamics, where prediction errors never fully resolve and the mind keeps rechecking the same variables. The felt experience is mental noise, but the underlying issue is a system that cannot settle into a clean, integrated state. Intuition fits into this framework without becoming mystical. Much of intuition is fast inference built from prior learning, where the brain completes patterns before you can verbalize the steps. It can feel like direct knowing, because the conscious narrative arrives after the system has already converged on an answer. The sense of self can also be treated as a model, not a fixed entity. The brain integrates memory, body signals, social feedback, and goals into a persistent prediction of me. When that model is stable, consciousness feels coherent, and when it destabilizes, experience can feel fragmented or depersonalized. Metacognition, awareness of awareness, is another key variable. Two people can have similar perceptions, but very different insight into their own accuracy, confidence, and bias. That difference is measurable, and it changes how conscious content is evaluated and updated over time. Altered states add clarity here because they change the rules of integration and precision. Meditation can reduce compulsive narrative processing and increase stability of attention, while psychedelics can relax high-level priors and increase the variety of experienced patterns. The point is not to romanticize these states, but to note how reliably they shift the structure of awareness. If your channel's theme is inner frequency, the scientific translation is internal alignment. When prediction, sensation, emotion, and goals stop fighting each other, the system becomes less noisy and more coherent. In that state, consciousness often feels clearer, not because reality changed, but because the interface stabilized. Consciousness does not run in isolation, because brains are social regulators as much as they are sensory processors. The presence of other people changes attention, threat appraisal, and even basic physiology. That means your baseline state of awareness is partly shaped by the social field you move through every day. A simple example is entrainment, the tendency for humans to sync timing through speech rhythms, eye contact, and microgestures. This is not mystical, it is a measurable coordination process. When synchronization is smooth, conversation feels effortless, and thought becomes more coherent. Safety signals and threat signals are especially powerful because they retune the nervous system. In a safe context, the brain can allocate bandwidth to nuance, curiosity, and long-range planning. In a threat context, it prioritizes detection and defense, which narrows conscious content and increases noise. Modern media environments act like constant external perturbation. High novelty feeds keep the system in rapid switching mode, which can weaken sustained attention and reduce deep integration. The subjective result is often a scattered mind, but the mechanism is chronic retuning toward interruption. Culture also shapes consciousness by providing templates for the self-model. Language, norms, and shared narratives define what counts as meaningful, shameful, possible, or real. These scaffolds can stabilize experience, but they can also constrain what people can notice or admit to themselves. When people talk about group resonance, the clean scientific framing is shared predictive models. Groups coordinate when individuals align expectations about what will happen next and what signals matter. This alignment can amplify clarity and purpose, or it can amplify bias and collective distortion. The clinical and ethical stakes are not abstract. Better measures of awareness can improve coma assessment, anesthesia monitoring, and the treatment of disorders where consciousness fluctuates. It also raises questions about pain, agency, and responsibility when the brain's access to awareness is compromised. Finally, the rise of AI forces sharper definitions by contrast. If an artificial system can process information without subjective presence, it highlights the gap between function and experience. That gap is exactly why today's science is focusing on integration, coherence, and causal structure as the bridge between brain, environment, and lived awareness. What emerges from all this is a quieter but deeper conclusion. Consciousness science is shifting from hunting locations to mapping organization. The most informative signals are not single hotspots, but patterns that show integration, differentiation, and stable transitions. In other words, the new approach is about structure over scenery. This does not require denying brain mechanisms, and it does not require turning consciousness into mysticism. The brain clearly shapes what is accessible, reportable, and continuous. But the nature of subjective presence may not be fully captured by listing parts. It may depend on how the whole system holds together in time. In that space, the field hypothesis can be treated as a disciplined, open question. If consciousness is a fundamental property, then the brain's role is to enable coupling under certain conditions, like coherence and integration thresholds. If consciousness is emergent, then those same conditions may describe how experience arises from complex causal structure. Either way, the research frontier is becoming more causal. Perturbation methods, stimulation, anesthetic manipulation, and computational modeling are used to test what changes awareness rather than what merely correlates with it. That shift is how a hard problem becomes a scientific program. The practical payoff is already visible in medicine. Better biomarkers of consciousness can reduce uncertainty in coma care, improve anesthesia safety, and refine how we understand pain and awareness in nonverbal patients. These are not philosophical wins, they are real outcomes that push the science forward. There is also a conceptual payoff that matters for everyday life. If clarity of awareness tracks coherence, then many experiences people describe as mental fog, fragmentation, or overwhelm can be framed as measurable shifts in integration and stability. That framing does not replace psychology, it connects it to physiology and systems dynamics. The responsible stance is intellectual humility, with high standards. We should be skeptical of sweeping claims, including claims that consciousness is nothing but computation or, obviously, a cosmic force. Yet we should also recognize that the evidence is getting tighter and the models are getting more testable. So, the most accurate way to describe the future is not that science will suddenly explain everything. It is that science will keep narrowing the space of plausible explanations by linking lived experience to signal properties like coherence, resonance, and causal organization. And that is already a completely new way of approaching consciousness.